I would like to thank you for the attention that you have given to this evidence. Not only the evidence introduced by the state, but by the evidence introduced by the defense. It's clear, I think, to everyone, this jury has been paying attention and has been listening carefully to everyone's testimony. It is greatly appreciated, and we thank you for that. This is a criminal case. And in the United States of America, in every criminal case, there are certain fundamental things that apply. The rock-hard, bedrock principle of this country in a criminal case is that everyone is presumed innocent unless and until the state proves them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Everyone is presumed innocent. Now, let's talk a little bit about reasonable doubt. And I'm going to read you a part of the instruction that was given by the court on reasonable doubt, so we can, because we're going to be focusing on an aspect of that reasonable doubt during my talk. A reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendant may arise from the evidence, conflict of evidence, or the lack of evidence. And we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about the lack of evidence in this case. Now, in the United States of America, you can't guess somebody or suppose somebody or imagine somebody into the guilty box. They have to be proven through evidence. And what we have seen here, and we're going to march through this, what we have seen from the state is they've been asking you, oh, well, we didn't do this, but, you know, that doesn't matter. We didn't do that. That doesn't matter. Don't you guess? Don't you suppose? Don't you think? Don't you imagine it could have happened this way? That doesn't get it in this country. Thank goodness. They have to prove their case. Now, this case is about, I told you from the beginning, a terrible accident. A horrible, terrible accident that happened in a blink of an eye. And I told you in opening that we would talk about the fact that it happened faster than the blink of an eye. And we're going to get into that later. It happened faster than the blink of an eye. What happened on the call right after he's explaining to how long this had happened? What's the first thing that he does? What's the first thing that Mr. Ward does? He calls. He's in shock. He's stunned. He's obviously had some alcohol. You can tell it from his voice. And the officer said he smelled it on his breath. And he said in his interview that he had had a few drinks. What does he do? Now, they're accusing him of standing in their bedroom and sticking a gun in Mrs. Ward's face and pulling the trigger. But and that is absolutely ridiculous. Now, what's happened here? What happened here is that a horrible tragedy happened. The first thing he did is call the police. You don't have to leave your common sense in the parking deck when you come into this courthouse. You get to, now, does that make sense? Does it make sense that somebody who stuck a gun in his wife's face and pulled the trigger right into her face is then going to go 411, he's so upset and he gets transferred over? No. That's not what would happen. Please use your common sense. But what he's doing is he's calling out, he's seeking out, he's looking for the police to come to the house. He says, I shot my wife. That's what he says. He said, I shot my wife. And they're asking him questions. He is responding to their questions, and they actually get him on with somebody else from the fire department, same questions. And that's when he's responding and saying, they asked, did you purposely do this? And he said, no. Was it an accident? Yes, he said. Now, the state wants you to come in and listen to the first part where he's saying, well, he said he shot my wife. But pay no attention, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state would want you to pay no attention to what he says in the other part of the 911 call. It's critical that you listen to the 911 call and focus on what he said and why he said it. Did you purposely do this? No. Was it an accident? It was an accident. What does he say? He says the gun just went off. And this is moments after this event, where he's clearly stunned, clearly shocked. He says the gun just went off. And that's exactly what he said 2 years later in his interview with Channel 13. The gun just went on. So from Jump Street on that 911 call to their interview, that common theme is the same. The gun just went off. Now, why does the state want you to pay no attention to that part of the case? Pay no attention to the fact that he said the gun just went off. Pay no attention to the fact that he said it was an accident. Pay no attention that he said he didn't do it purposely. And the reason is found in the jury instruction that the court just gave you, that's going to be out with you. And when we talk about an excusable event, even if you were to find and believe, even if you were to find and believe that Bob Ward caused the shooting, then it is excusable when the killing occurs by accident and misfortune in the heat of passion upon any sudden and sufficient provocation. That's the reason why they don't want you to focus on that accident aspect, because as we said in opening statement, that is no crime. It is a terrible tragedy. It is no crime. Now, the state just got up and talked a little bit about the email. Again, he's just lost his wife. He is in the sheriff's department. Now, they've already taken his phone and put it into custody. Did you notice what they did? It was already in evidence. They'd already filled out the evidence form, but they took it out and gave it to him, didn't they? They wanted maybe to use that phone. Why would you take something out of the evidence, because the evidence form had already been filled out, and they gave it to him? And what does he do? Obviously upset with the lawyers for the trustee that were causing some of the stress, or a great deal of the stress in the family. He says, now Diane, Diane killed herself. Now he did that out of anger, he did that out of shock. But one thing let's be clear about, that Bob Ward never said in that email, he never said in the 911 call, and he never said in the interview with Channel 13 that his wife committed suicide. There's a difference. Let me tell you what the difference is. Now, a suicide would be someone willfully and intentionally kind of sitting down and saying, I'm now going to take my life. I'm going to kill myself. That's not what happened here. And that's not what the defense is arguing to you. But what we are arguing to you is this. Did Diane Ward kill herself? And the answer is yes, for this reason. What she did is she set into motion actions. She set into motion actions that caused her death with that gun behind him. Now, we learned a lot about Diane Ward during this trial. We know that she was married for 26 years to Mr. Ward, two lovely children, Mallory and Sarah. But you know what? You know what else? Secrets. She had secrets. She had secrets that even her children, best friends, the children, didn't know about. What were those secrets? The secrets were revealed to us through Dr. Sally West, her physician at Emory. that for years and years and years she suffered from chronic anxiety. In December of 2007, uncontrollable anxiety, and the phrase catastrophic thinking, paralyzed by anxiety. And what did Dr. West tell you about what was happening from 2007 up until the last time she saw her? She said that she was more and more frantic. And the next phrase I want you to focus on, more and more unstable. That's what Dr. West said, more and more unstable. And that she was always on the edge. She was on the edge. But you know, that's exactly what the Channel 13 interview shows when Bob Ward is talking to Channel 13 and said, for the last several months, she had a history of snapping. And that's what happened here. She did snap. Unstable, frantic, and ultimately snapped. Now, her daughter, Sarah, testified that she had given up drinking red wine. Had given it up. But then what happened? When did she start drinking red wine again? She started drinking red wine again the week before this happened. She went back to red wine, the thing that had been a problem for her. So she goes back to red wine within a week of going down to Florida. So what was in her system? Now, this is the secret. The secrets are the daughters don't know this, the best friends don't know this, her sister doesn't know this. These are her secrets. She was taking Celexa if she had taken it on an appropriate level, it was at a level that was even more than would be approved right now today by the FDA. You couldn't even get the FDA does not recommend 60 milligrams today. She was taking it. But what happened with that is that sometimes she would reach for the pills and take pills, and her daughter said they were happy pills. You know, she was down, she'd take her happy pills. So we read the warning in, part of the side effects from Celexa, side effects, potential hostility, aggression, anxiety, especially in changes of dosage. Diane changed her dosage herself by taking too much Celexa. The diagnosis, depression, anxiety, plus the financial pressures, plus the Celexa, plus the alcohol level of 1.2 times, plus a gun, equals a gun accident and a gun tragedy. Now this is even worse when you're dealing with a combination, a toxic combination of Celexa and alcohol. Now what do you get when you get a toxic combination like that? Well, we've known 1.5 times the legal limit of alcohol. We also heard testimony, 840 nanograms of Celexa that was taken from the blood, whether that was a peak or normal. We've heard testimony about that. One thing we'll never know, because they dropped the ball on the stomach contents, didn't they? Didn't think that was important. I think they figured they'd already got their conclusion in this case. So they did a lot of things that were not appropriate. That combination created a toxic cocktail for Diane Ward. Now I want to talk a little bit about no motive. We just heard a little bit about the motive from the state. What happened here is there was pressure being built and put on the wards. Mrs. Ward, Mr. Ward. Now, we heard the Professor Davis, and he testified to the following. He told us about attendance by the entirety. And what that's like is, if I have if I owe somebody $10,000 and I can't pay them, if I, in Florida, if I have an asset with my wife, then that creditor can't get their hands on my the $10,000 in that account. That's tenants by the entirety. So that the assets that were over at $9 million, real money where I come from, $9 million they were part of the financial protective bubble that was over Diane and Bob Ward. As long as one thing happened, as long as Diane Ward remained alive, as long as Diane Ward was alive, they could sit there, and unless they had a judgment against her, then that not over $9 million, have a nice day, bonding company. Have a nice day, creditors. You can't get it. Her life was the most important thing for the financial security of that family. And the professor testified that her death was a financial disaster for the Wards. A financial disaster is what he said. Now, what you also heard, and the government just got up and said, well, you know, she had been sued by a bonding company, and both of them had. Well, the thing about it is, in America, I guess anybody can sue just about anybody. But the problem is, if you don't have grounds to do it, then that might be a problem in getting your hands on the asset. What did Ms. Green say this morning? Why did we call her in here to focus on this? We called her in here because we called her in here to say Bob Ward had signed personal guarantees on the businesses in the millions of dollars. No personal guarantees by Diane Ward. Zero. So if somebody doesn't have a personal guarantee by Diane Ward, it's a whole different ballgame if you're trying to get Bob Ward's asset and his wife is sitting there going, no personal guarantees from me. And they speculate, don't they? This is another one of those speculation, let's imagine, let's guess. And we're getting a lot, this is no place to guess. This is serious business in here. And this is no place to guess. They want you to guess. Well, maybe down the road she'd get sued. Well, maybe down the road they would have discovered something. Maybe, maybe, maybe. Guess, guess, guess. But the reality is that what you have, the evidence that you have, no personal guarantees by Diane Ward. She was the financial safe haven for them. He had absolutely no motive to take her life, and he had every motive, financial motive in the world to make sure that no matter what happened in their lives, that she survived. That's huge. State says, well, you know, there's not really, it's not one of the elements. You know, motive isn't one of the elements. But you know, when you analyze why people do things, when you're sitting there saying, why did somebody do that? Why would someone do something? You ask them, what would be their motive? And that's part of that common sense you get to bring in. You don't have to leave that in the car. You get to bring it in the jury box. What was the motive? And everybody, I hope, will agree that Bob Ward would want, because he loved her, number one, but number two, financially, it was critical that she remain alive. And then the state, bizarrely, in the cross-examination of Professor Davis, gets up and says, well, yeah, but isn't there a statute that if it's proven that he kills her, that he only gets half? What? That makes no sense at all. Because the bottom line is that if she's dead, all of it would go to him, and his creditors could get it all. It's not protected. If she's gone, I don't care whether he has 100% of it. I don't care whether he has 50% of it. That's a red herring they want you to follow down or go down into the rabbit hole with over the motive. The bottom line, it's very, very simple. Tenants by the entirety need to have Diane Ward. That's over $9 million that was protected under that tenants by the entirety. Now, they talked about the deposition. Well, the deposition wasn't going to happen. Yeah, eventually it was going to happen down the road, but there was no deposition was going to taking place on Thursday. You saw the email. Her lawyer said, "We're not coming. No one will be there. Have a nice day. We're not going to come." So that whole deposition thing is also a red herring. Again, back to the secrets. The closest family and friends not aware of the depths, of her problem and her mental and emotional problems. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about is the science. And the science, as it relates to her, what's in her body, we've talked about. We're also going to talk about the science that was available to the police and would have been available to this jury to make a decision that speaks the truth had they done their job, had they not just mailed it in. And there was an expression that several of them, or two of them at least, used during the trial of this case that I hope, as citizens of this community, you are troubled by. And that is, when I asked about, did you do this, did you do that? Not my job. It's not my job. Why didn't you do the GSR? But not my job. Why didn't you, after you got the bags, why didn't you send the bedroom? Hey, that's not my job. But they come into court and they want you to guess about all those results because they didn't do their job. Because they say, hey, it's not my job. So what happens that night? What happens that night? Remember what Sarah said. This is really interesting. Because, Sarah loves her mother. She loves her father. And it's tough for the family to come in and testify. They came in and they testified, and they came in and testified on behalf of Bob. But she said, my mom would pick fights. She would pick fights with my dad. Now this is Diane's daughter telling you this. My mother would pick fights with my dad. And you know what he would do? He would turn and he would walk away. That's what she said. So let's piece together what we think based upon that happened that night. That is, we see some wine on the back of his shirt, back where she goes from talking to people that thought that she was just fine, even her daughters, even her friends. They didn't know the toxic cocktail that was inside her body. They didn't know about the alcohol. They didn't know about the Celexa. They thought she was just fine, but she wasn't just fine. Because after that Spearman call, what happens? She throws a glass of wine in his back. But what does he do? The evidence, I suggest, would show, just like he did, just like Sarah said, he walks away. There aren't any evidences of any kind of struggle or knocked over lamps or anything else down there on the patio. So he just walks away. Let's talk about, we just talked about picking fights. Here's something that you might have caught during the trial. It's a subtle point, but I think it's an important one. When the government went in, they took all the electronic, the phones and the computers and all that from Diane and from Bob. And they had access to all of the texts and the emails in there. Remember that? He just said it. We just kind of let it go by. If there was one single ugly email from Bob Ward to Diane, Don't you know they would have blown it up bigger than the doors in this courtroom? Not one. Not one. After they had access to all of the electronic lives of Bob Ward and Diane Ward, they couldn't come in here and show you one email to support their theory, their guesswork, that Bob Ward unlawfully murdered his wife. Evidence destroyed or ignored. Lack of evidence. Now, we talked about this lack of evidence, and when I say lack of evidence, I'm talking about evidence you'll never have access to. You'll never be able to know some of this evidence. DNA. Now, what happened with the DNA? We know that they did DNA on the grip. Now, we asked the investigator, Ms. Vibert, why did you do that? Well, she admitted that what she really wanted to know was whether or not whose DNA was on the trigger. That was the critical thing, and that's the reason why they packaged it up separately and sent it to the lab, because they wanted test on the DNA on the trigger, and then they wanted test on the DNA on the grip. And that's why they did it. What did they do at the lab, Miss Vita? Well, I just took them, they were two separate, and I just mixed them together. What does it matter? It matters because this jury will never have the opportunity to analyze the DNA on the trigger, the very thing that their crime scene investigator wanted more than anything else. But they don't mind coming in here and telling you, pay no attention to that. Pay no attention to the fact that we, in my view, destroyed the key piece of evidence. We want you to reach a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that Bob Ward is a murderer. You know, so we messed up with our DNA. Well, we don't think we messed up. We think it's just fine that we combined them. And then the government gets up and says, well, gee, has anybody, and this is a clever trick that was done throughout the trial, does anybody really think that you can't have a pull the trigger without the grip? Have you said so many times that was asked? That is not the point. You can hold a gun on the grip without holding your finger on the trigger. That is the point. You can hold a gun without having your finger on the trigger. People have done it in this courtroom for the entire trial, holding the gun without putting their finger on the trigger. And that's the reason why their crime scene expert wanted to have the trigger DNA done. But you'll never see that because they have destroyed that. The trigger DNA is gone. And they say, that's okay. But then we had our expert, Ms. Peterson, come in. You know, it's interesting, Ms. Peterson says, Diane Ward's DNA is on the gun, period. But, they criticize Ms. Peterson. Well, I guess what they ought to do is they ought to write a letter to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and tell them that the United States Department of Justice shouldn't be hiring.
Proper argument.
Sustained.
That, why do you think the Department of Justice,
Sustained. Move on, please.
well, as to her, I can go into her credibility in her experience.
Mr. Gillen, no speaking objections. If you need to speak to me, I'll speak to you at sidebar.
Okay. Well, as to her credentials, you may remember she was hired by the Department of Justice to go to Kosovo to set up for the UN a DNA lab. Now, that's the same woman that testified, number one, that you should not be mixing the DNA, number two, that Diane Ward's DNA was on the gun, and that the way that Vita did it, violated the standard operating procedures for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, because she used to be there. And she testified she also does accreditation for labs. So when the state says, no, it's okay, no, it's not okay. They violated their own standard operating procedures when they mix those DNA together. There's not anything we can do about it. Boy, I wish we had them. Because if we had them, and Diane Ward's DNA was on the trigger, we would not be here, would we? Now, the holster. Well, why didn't you test the holster? Why did you not do DNA test on the holster? Well, it was there. I didn't do it because, you know, they all have the same access in the house, and so I don't think that it would, that it would have been worth it, frankly. Well, you see, that's assuming. They just assumed certain things. They just assumed that there was equal access to the gun in the holster. And what Dr. Anderson said this morning, as a scientist, what you do is you take all the data, and then you figure it out later what works and what doesn't work, but you take it all and you run your tests. You don't sit there in a bedroom with Mrs. Ward dead on the floor and say, you know, maybe it's getting late. I don't want to take the time to run DNA on the holster. What do we know about the holster and the gun now? They assumed something that night and that early morning that was wrong. What do we know? It's Bob's gun. What else do we know? It was in Bob's holster. What else do we know? It was placed inside. He would put it inside Bob's nightstand. And where is the nightstand? On Bob's side of the bed. So, if Diane Ward's DNA were on that holster, that would lead this jury to conclude that she had gone in, taken the holster. You can't get the gun out without holding the holster and getting the gun out. That would have shown that she had gotten the gun out and taken the gun out. But we will never know that because they decided maybe it was too late, time to get home, whatever. They didn't do their job, and that assumption now, they want you to assume, to conclude, to guess, to speculate that he's guilty. Lack of evidence. GSR. I love it on the GSR. They ran these tests. They had an expert come in, and then when they don't like the results, they stand up and say, you know what? We don't even do that anymore. So pay no attention to it. Pay no attention to the GSR, even though that's what we do, or what we did. The only GSR in this case is on Diane Ward's left hand. And there is no evidence whatsoever that Bob Ward he didn't have any GSR in his hand, and there is no evidence, they've got their witness to confirm this, no evidence whatsoever that he washed his hands. As a matter of fact, to the contrary, I had their GSR guy admit that the GSR on the testing on his hands showed elements that was kind of consistent with all sorts of other things, not GSR, but even silica, which would have a little bit of dirt on them. He didn't wash his hands. He didn't have any GSR in his hands. But, and then they say, well, you know what, it was sometimes if you wait too long, then you don't get the GSR. Really? Less than 1 minute after Bob Ward hung up on that 911 call, he was in their custody. Less than 1 minute. They had him. They could have done GSR on him right there on the spot. They could have driven him back to the sheriff's office and done GSR on him. No, they waited 3 hours, and then they come into this courtroom and accuse him of murder and say, well, sometimes if you wait that long, it doesn't really, you can't register it. Their failure to do it right, and they're asking you to draw conclusions to the contrary. Now, that's again asking Ms. Vibert, well, why didn't you take the GSR on Mrs. Ward at the scene? Well, I can't, the body belongs to the medical examiner, I can't do it, and that's the way that goes, so it can't be done. All right, well, they say, the medical examiner says, look, if we're asked, then we can have someone come and do that. But you got to ask. You got to ask. So they don't ask, and they don't do the GSR on the scene on her hands. Now, what about the other GSR? And this gets a little, this is disturbing. I'm asking Ms. Fiber, well, why didn't you do GSR testing on the clothes? Under oath, the crime scene investigator for this case says under oath, it can't be done. You can't do GSR on clothing. Really? Well, why didn't you do GSR on the walls? Can't be done. Really? What about the bags? Can't be done, you can't get GSR on paper. And that's what she testified under oath here, to try to explain and to rationalize why she didn't do her job. Because her job was to get the GSR. And then how do we prove that you can get GSR? Didn't take long. In come the other state's witnesses, and they're coming on in, and Scala, Radcliffe, Dr. Stephanie, yeah, sure, you can get GSR off clothes. You can get GSR off of paper, but they didn't do it. They didn't do it. Well, now, they told us about bagging the hands, and we're going to take and then we talked about going down and jostling the hands and all that. We want to preserve the evidence on the hands. Okay? Preserve the evidence on the hands. That's nice. So when you cut the bags off of the hands, why don't you test the bags? Oh, we don't do that. We never do that. Why don't you do it? We asked the medical examiner, Dr. Stephanie, and he says, what did he say? Not my job. That's what they all said. Kick the can down the road. We'll get into court, tell the jury they ought to convict Bob Ward. I'm not worried about it. It's not my job. So the medical examiner says it's up to the investigators. Investigators say, well, we've turned over the body. It's not my job. It's not my job. We'll just have them guess a little bit. But there's something about the GSR that's really important that could have solved some of the issues that we have been dealing with in this case. And what is that? And that has to do with GSR on the walls. Because the important thing here, remember, is you do not have an exit wound. There's no exit wound here on the back of Mrs. Ward's head. And so if there had been an exit wound, then you would have been able to see in the wall, in a trajectory, and you would have been able to put together where people were, how people were moving, what they were doing when the gun went off. But without the exit wound, there was another way they could have done it. Take the GSR off the walls. Because if you have GSR over here on this wall here, then you would know, in a pattern, then you would know that the gun was pointed in this direction. You would have been able to determine the direction of the weapon. You wouldn't have to speculate. You wouldn't have to guess. You wouldn't have to sit in here and have everybody kind of say, gee, it could have been this and it could have been that. It's all something that could have been done if it was done correctly. But they want you to guess Bob Ward into the guilty box. And lack of evidence, that says no. chaos. Chaos is really what happened up there in that room. Because you don't have the GSR on the wall, you really don't have a way to show with any kind of reasonable certainty where in that tight space over there by Bob Ward's side of the bed, where Mrs. Ward had come around, that's where she was. She came around to his side of the bed. Why? Do they really want you to believe that if someone is going to be shot in the face at virtual point-blank range, that they're going to walk around to a tight area to somebody else's side of the bed? Please.
Assuming facts, not an evidence that she was on the other side of the bed.
Sustained.
She was found on his side of the bed. And on her side of the bed was a computer lit in the screen, and that was her computer. So, do you really believe, are they going to have you actually reach a conclusion that she would go over to his side of the bed and then sit and watch a gun being pointed in her face and go off? Please, use your common sense. Please use your common sense. That did not happen. But chaos happened. Chaos happened very, very quickly. And we heard testimony about recoil. Now they talk about, now Bob Ward had said, as it related to his lying down, he hadn't been lying down. Did Bob Ward from recoil get, from the recoil of a gun that went off or the shock that went off, go momentarily down on his bed? We don't know. We don't know that. But that's certainly something that is consistent with the chaos that took place up there in that room. And not knowing, we would have known how to play it out if they had done their job and the GSR on the walls. But they say, it's interesting, the state has said, well, gee, and every time they do one of their demonstrations, they have their hands out like this. What do we really think? What is more probable? If people are struggling over a gun, they don't sit there and go like this. If you're struggling over a gun or virtually anything, you're in here. You're down in here, where the distance of whether it's 12 inches or 14 inches, here is where the struggle is taking place. That is where the struggle is taking place. And they say, well, that couldn't happen, and they come up with some different analysis of about why she couldn't have been bent over. But the recoil from the gun could have done anything to her body position, because they were all moving so quickly. It happened that fast. It happened so quickly. So then, struggle for the gun, as Mr. Ward said in his interview, struggling for the gun goes off, Mrs. Ward is dead, and there he is, and there's the gun, and then he's calling 911. He wants to make sure that the gun is put back up so it's safe when the police come. He doesn't want to have a situation where the police will not be safe when they come out there. On the distance, we have a situation where Steyer says 12 inches. He's kind of almost the world expert. But the one thing that he said, that their expert said, we got distance is essentially 12 inches, and we've got eyes wide open. Now, this is really important. I said it was important in the beginning. It's even more important as we've gone through here. If, as they have speculated, that Bob Ward has got a gun pointed into his wife's face and pulls a trigger, what would have happened? Use your common sense. She would have gone up in a defensive pose like that, and she would have closed her eyes. If he was shooting at her, she would have closed her eyes. Her eyes would have been closed, and they weren't. They were wide open. Why? Why were her eyes wide open? They were wide open because she was struggling over a gun. And when you're struggling over something like a gun, you're focusing on that. You're focusing on the gun. And in focusing on the gun and struggling, the gun goes off. But it went off when her eyes were wide open while she was focusing on the object of the struggle, the gun. Absolutely critical. As he said, fighting over the gun went off. That's exactly what he said to Channel 13. That's consistent, and people don't struggle like this. That's ridiculous. People struggle in here. Everyone knows that. Use your common sense. More guessing, more assumptions, more. We have speculation about no testing on the fiber test, no fingerprints. Why? Well, they just assumed. They just assumed that that if it's in the bedroom, that Diane Ward's fingerprints would be on that. Wouldn't you like to know if Diane Ward's fingerprints were over on that drawer where the gun was kept? Wouldn't that be a fact that you'd like to know? You'll never will. They just didn't want to do it. Didn't have time. I guess it was getting late. Fingernails. Clip the fingernails. Well, what test did you run on the fingernail? Didn't run any tests. Didn't run GSR testing on it. Didn't run any test on it. Okay. Just assuming, guessing, wanting you to assume and guess and come to a conclusion that the evidence proves Bob Ward guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, based upon guess, based upon guess, and based upon guess. No defensive wounds, no scratches, no scrapes. What does that mean? That means that they weren't, when a man and a woman, if they're going to get into some physical argument with each other, there might be scratching, there might be scraping, there might be, so that, you'd have scratches on Miss Ward. No defensive wounds, and they didn't test under the fingernails to see whether or not there was any DNA or any flesh of Bob Ward, because as she indicated on the stand, well, there were no defensive wounds. The room didn't show evidence of any sort of fight. Things weren't turned over like you usually see in a physical altercation, and so we didn't even test the fingernails. That's what she said. There was a slight bruise, they pointed out. We don't know whether it's a bruise or not or when it was, but that's kind of consistent with a struggle over a weapon. Now, one of the things that the state wants you to do is they want you to convict Bob Ward of murder. To do that, the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ward killed Diane Ward and that he did it with ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. Has the state proved any of that? They've proved none of that. That's what they have to prove in order to get a second-degree murder. That's what they have to prove. So what I want you to focus on here is that every one of the following is a reason to doubt. Every one of the following that I'm going to say is a reason to doubt. And if you find it to be a reasonable doubt, then you must acquit. Number one, no motive. Number two, accident. Said it was an accident at 911, said it was an accident at Channel 13. Number three, trigger not tested for DNA. Reasonable doubt. Number four, Diane Ward, DNA on gun. Number five, no DNA testing on holster. Number six, toxic mix of her drugs and alcohol. Number seven, always on the edge. She was always on the edge, according to Dr. West. Unstable, becoming more and more unstable, and frantic, more and more frantic. And then Bob Ward says, from time to time, she snapped. Sarah Ward. Diane Ward blamed Bob Ward for the financial reversals. She blamed Bob Ward for the financial reversals. Number 9, GSR, no GSR on Bob Ward, GSR on Diane Ward. No guessing here, no test. Every time they didn't do a test they should have done that could have let you know what really happened. The state, the defense doesn't have to prove anything, nothing. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And they can't do it by adding inference upon guess upon inference upon imagining all of the scenarios that they want to imagine when they had the tools. They had the tools with them to do what they should have done. And that's only fair to Bob Ward, but frankly, it's also fair and only fair to the system. And it's fair and only fair for the jury to get the full picture of what the science would tell us about what happened there. Again, never know about the DNA on the trigger, no GSR testing on the clothes, and the investigator said it can't be done, and she was impeached by 3 of her colleagues who said it could be done. Stomach contents, no stomach contents tested. Yeah, didn't want to do it. That would have told you what was in her stomach. That would have told you the extent of the citalopram in her stomach. But no testing was done. No GSR testing on the walls. No fingerprints. No fingernail testing. On and on and on and on of no, 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 no. Now, I'm running up on the time that I have to close. It's always a difficult time for a lawyer because I have to sit down, and when I sit down, I cannot come back up here in front of you and say, well, Mr. J just said A, B, C, and D, but the answer to that is X, Y, and Z. I can't do that. So I will ask you, when issues are raised by Mr. J, say to yourself, what would Mr. Gillen say about that? How would he respond? We've seen the evidence. We've heard his argument. How would he respond to what Mr. J is saying about that Mr. Gillen cannot respond to in any way? And then I have to now turn it over to the jury for your deliberation. But there's one thing that I want to raise, the last one on doubt and reasonable doubt that I want to talk to you about. And that is this. And that is about 3 witnesses who came in here. Paula, the sister and best friend to Diane Ward. Mallory, the daughter, and Sarah. What did Paula say? She talked about, and these 3 people knew Diane Ward and Bob Ward and their relationship better than anyone else in the world. And they've come in. Paula has indicated, that last Christmas, December 2017, Christmas celebration was with Paula, Diane's mother, also Paula's mother,
Check
Mallory.
evidence.
Sustained.
It was in evidence, Your Honor.
Oh, he's correct. Go ahead. Thanks.
Christmas, December 2017. Paula, with her mother, same mother of Diane Ward, Mallory, and Sarah, and Bob Ward, celebrating Christmas together. Now, these people know Bob Ward and they know Diane Ward better than anyone else. The nightmare for the Ward family began on that tragic accident, December the 21st, 2009. It has gone on since December the 21st, 2009, until today. I'm going to ask this jury to look at the evidence, to analyze what is introduced and all the things that they didn't introduce, to reach a verdict that speaks the truth, a verdict of not guilty, and let the nightmare finally end for the wards. Thank you very much.